a small mirror the size of a hand, in the blazing battlefield of 1944, saved the lives of hundreds of American soldiers. Not an invention by an engineer, not a strategy from a general, but the idea of a 24-year-old mechanic amid gunpowder smoke and burning steel. September 1944, Eastern France. The Lorraine fog was so thick that soldiers couldn't even see the head of the tank in front of them. Beneath the cold mist, American M4 Shermans rumbled through the mud. Behind them echoed the sound of artillery from the woods. Ahead was a place called Aracourt, a small, peaceful village on the map, now turning into a battlefield of steel beasts. Operation Lorraine, part of General George S. Patton's plan, was paving the way for the Allies to penetrate the heart of Germany. But hidden deep within the distant trees, the Nazis had set a trap. 47 Panthers, Germany's most sophisticated tanks, were lying in wait. Each one a mechanical masterpiece, thick armor, powerful guns, and Zeiss scopes that could see up to 2,000 meters. They were built to hunt and destroy Shermans, and they did so all too well. In the first 3 weeks of September, Patton's 4th Armored Division lost 23 tanks. 23 bursts of fire, 23 crews vanished, all because of one thing. The Panthers saw them first. 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds earlier, an armor-piercing shell could decide who lived and who died. Inside one of the many rolling Shermans was a young soldier named Frank Thompson. Sergeant, 24 years old. From Pennsylvania. A mechanic before the war, now a loader, responsible for ramming a 75mm shell into the cannon every 6 seconds, amid clanging metal, smoke, and deafening pressure. He had survived 12 tank battles, but had seen 11 of his friends burn to death in turrets. He wasn't a hero, not famous, just an ordinary soldier. But it was he, amid the flames of Aracourt, who came up with something no general had thought of. A small shaving mirror, metal-framed, reflecting light in the dark. And from that moment, history changed. No one knows who Frank Thompson was. No textbook writes his name. But in the Battle of Aracourt, it was his idea that turned Shermans into beasts with eyes on their backs, helping his comrades survive, helping the entire army survive. That story didn't start on the battlefield, but in the very factories where America turned steel, oil, and sweat into belief. The belief that every problem can be solved by human hands. World War II was not just a war of artillery, it was a war of steel chains, oil, and human hands. While the Germans placed their faith in precision engineering, the Americans believed in human ingenuity. These were two opposing philosophies. One was cold, mechanical perfection. The other was a belief that good enough and on time could beat perfect but too late. In factories across America, from Detroit to Pittsburgh, millions of workers turned workshops into a second battlefield. Every bolt, every hastily welded piece of steel, every assembly line ran 24 hours a day. They called America the arsenal of democracy. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a declaration of war through industry. While it took Germany 150,000 hours to build a Panther, Americans needed only 10,000 hours to produce a Sherman. If the Germans built a single refined steel beast, the Americans made 10 iron lions, strong enough to fight, simple enough to fix, and plentiful enough to never run out. In the plants of Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, millions of workers, including women, mothers, ponytailed girls with oil-stained hands, turned sheets of metal into tanks, cannons, and planes. None of them knew that one day, a soldier in Lorraine would use the very shaving mirror they packed into a supply crate to change the course of a battle. Frank Thompson was a product of that generation, a mechanic born in furnace smoke, raised with the sound of hammers and the smell of burning steel. Before the war, He fixed tractors, trucks, anything with an engine. He didn't know tactics or maps, but he knew when a shaft was off or an engine was dying. At Fort Knox, he trained not with dreams of medals, but with the habit of never giving up when the machine stopped. And that was exactly what America needed. Not just people who could shoot, but people who could think. His machine, the Sherman, was no monster like the Panther, but it was the child of an industry that knew how to balance power and flexibility. It was lighter, faster, easier to repair, and more importantly, could be mass-produced to the point where Patton once said, "If the Sherman doesn't win with one shot, it'll win with 10. Tens of thousands of Shermans rolled off the lines like children born with a single mission: advance. But what truly set the Sherman apart wasn't its numbers. It was the people who operated it. Soldiers like Frank, who dared to do what no one else had done, dared to fix, to improvise, to believe that one small idea could save a comrade's life. In that context, Frank's silly little trick was no accident. It was the product of an entire culture, a culture that treated creativity as a weapon. While the Panther relied on Zeiss optics to see 2 kilometers ahead, the Sherman relied on a soldier who could look into a mirror and say, "I can see farther with this." That difference, seemingly small, reflected an entire philosophy of war. Germans trusted machines. Americans trusted people. In every workshop, every factory, millions of other Frank Thompsons were doing the same. They didn't wait for orders, didn't wait for approval. They acted when needed. They turned useless things into weapons, fear into innovation, and silliness into survival. When Shermans crossed the Atlantic from Detroit, they didn't just carry steel armor and cannons, they carried that spirit. The spirit that every problem could be solved with human hands and minds. And when Frank Thompson looked into his little shaving mirror that night, he didn't know that behind that reflection stood the power of an entire industry backing him. An America that believed in something no one else dared to. That sometimes the most ridiculous things can save the world. September 18th, 1944. The Lorraine fog was thick like a white curtain swallowing the entire sky. The humidity was so high that water dripped off the tank armor. The soldiers could see nothing but faint headlights ahead, and the heavy growl of engines roaring beneath the mist. On the map, Aricourt was just a small village in southeastern France, but to the Germans, it was the key to halting Patton's advance. To the Americans, it was the gateway into Germany. Both sides knew. Whoever held Aricourt controlled all of Lorraine. The Germans launched a counterattack with the main armored force of the 5th Panzer Army, battle-hardened units from the Eastern Front. They had the latest Panthers and Panzer IVs, upgraded with 75mm L-70 guns capable of piercing Sherman armor from over 1,000 meters. These were supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled Stug 3s, all hidden in the forests surrounding Aricourt, waiting for favorable weather. And the fog on the morning of September 18th was the perfect opportunity. On the American side, Patton's 4th Armored Division had its forces spread out, believing the Germans had retreated. They didn't know that 47 Panthers were advancing toward them. At the heart of the defense line was the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Colonel Creighton Abrams. One of the tanks in Company C, Sherman No. 18, belonged to Sergeant Frank Thompson. Inside the cramped hull, Thompson sat at the loader's position, with 76 rounds of 75mm shells stacked along the tank's walls. He had 6 seconds to load a shell, lock the breech, and fall back. 6 seconds between life and death. To his right, Gunner William Crawford peered through the scope, a narrow optical tube offering only a 30-degree view. Above, the tank commander scanned continuously through binoculars, trying to cut through the thick fog. Outside, the other Shermans of the company were spread across the fields, a few hundred meters apart, in marching formation. The radio crackled in Thompson's headset, mixing static with a voice. "Movement reported to the north. Possibly Panthers." Just then, the first cannon blast ripped through the air. A frontline Sherman burst into flames. The commander shouted through the intercom, "All tanks lower guns, find cover." Thompson ducked, cold sweat running down his neck, even though it was only 10 degrees. He knew exactly what was happening. The Panthers had spotted them first. 2 more explosions. 2 more Shermans turned into fireballs. Inside Thompson's tank, Crawford still couldn't find a target. The view was too narrow. Everything was white. "Where are they?" Crawford shouted. The commander replied, "Wait for the smoke signal." But before a signal could be given, an 88mm shell whooshed past the tank's side and slammed into the ground just meters away, the shockwave shaking the entire hull. Thompson gritted his teeth, gripping a shell tightly. In that moment, he understood. If they couldn't see first, they would die just like the others. Martinez, Kozlowski, all of them. As the smoke began to clear and the fog started to lift, he saw in the distance a black shape slithering out from the tree line. A panther. It was the first time he saw the thing that had killed his friends. The Battle of Aracourt began like that. No glory, no sophisticated tactics, just fog, fire, and survival. The Germans believed they would crush the Shermans like they did in Normandy, but they didn't know that in the days ahead, the weapon that would bring them defeat wouldn't be the 75mm gun or sloped armor. It would be the intelligence and courage of men like Frank Thompson. And when night fell among the burned-out wrecks, Thompson would have a small idea, just enough to change the course of the entire Battle of Aracourt. Night of September 18th, 1944. The battle had quieted. The fields of Lorraine were blanketed in fog and smoke, where the wrecks of Sherman tanks still smoldered. The air was filled with the sting of oil, hot steel, and gunpowder, mixing into the freezing cold. Frank Thompson sat alone in a makeshift maintenance area on the outskirts of Aracourt. He removed his gloves, his hands blackened with soot. In the distance, welding sparks flickered, hammers clanged against metal, and a generator hummed like the faint heartbeat of a division that had survived another day. Thompson looked toward a burned-out hull nearby, wisps of smoke rising like the souls of his fallen comrades drifting skyward. He thought of James Martinez, the loader who died just a week earlier, of David Kozlowski, the steelworker from Chicago, who once said, "After the war, we'll open our own shop." Now, none of them were alive to keep that promise. They had died for one reason. German tanks always saw first, always fired first. He looked northward, where distant flares blinked in the sky. Then, as if struck by something, a thought sparked. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a small object, a 3.4-inch shaving mirror, silver metal frame, scratched and dulled from long marches. It was something he'd carried with him since training at Fort Knox, used each morning to shave, and occasionally to check his reflection on the rare, quiet day. Thompson turned the mirror in his hand. The flashlight's beam reflected off the cold steel and bounced onto the turret beside him. That reflection stopped him in his tracks. If he could place the mirror at just the right angle, the gunner could see to the left, behind them, a blind spot the main sight would never reach. A small idea, so simple it almost felt stupid. But in Frank's mind, it lit up brighter than anything else. He stood and walked over to his Sherman. Beneath the dim oil lamp, he opened the gunner's hatch. No blueprint, no orders, but he was done waiting for permission. He just wanted to survive. He just didn't want to see anyone else burn inside a tank. Thompson grabbed his repair kit, a hand drill, some screws, wire, and pliers. He drilled into the steel wall in silence, each screech, screech, echoing sharply into the night. Every drill sound was a challenge to military regulations, a prayer for his crew's lives. After 40 minutes, he finished. The small mirror was fastened with wire, tilted at a 45-degree angle just to the left of the gunner's seat. When Crawford sat there the next morning, all he had to do was glance sideways to see the rear flank, a blind spot they'd always been blind to. Frank sat down, looking at the mirror reflecting the oil lamp's glow. He saw his face, tired, stained with grease, eyes red from smoke, but something in that reflection had changed. Not despair, hope. A small hope, shining from something so ordinary in the middle of a war. He let out a faint smile, packed his tools back in the box, and turned off the light. Outside, the wind rustled the grasslands, and distant engines kept their steady rhythm. Tomorrow they would fight again. No one would know about the mirror. No one was allowed to know. But he believed 3 seconds of earlier sight, 3 seconds more of life, could sometimes mean an entire lifetime. Dawn, September 19th, 1944. The thick fog over the Lorraine fields slowly faded in the pale sunlight. The air was heavy with the smell of oil, smoke, and moisture. The Shermans lined up awaiting orders, their engines idling steadily, shaking beneath the soldiers' feet. Over the radio, the commander's voice echoed. "Prepare to move. Heading to Ericourt. Recon reports. German armor approaching." Frank Thompson sat in the loader's compartment, seatbelt across his chest, eyes glancing at the small mirror he had installed the night before. It reflected the view behind the tank, a new, unfamiliar angle, but it gave him an odd sense of comfort. Beside him, Gunner William Crawford checked the scope, adjusting the barrel. Tank Commander, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, gave a nod, signaling the advance. Company C began to roll out. Treads cut through damp soil, mud splattering, engines roaring like a mechanical symphony. They didn't know that just beyond the fading fog, 47 Panthers were heading straight for them. The clash was inevitable. 07:20 a.m. A barrage of 88 mm shells erupted from the forest on the right ridge. One Sherman went up in flames. A black column of smoke rose from the open field. Hayes shouted over the intercom, "Panther, north direction, spread out!" The Shermans immediately scattered, taking cover behind small hills. Thompson loaded the first shell quickly, hands trembling slightly. He could hear Crawford's heavy breathing through the headset. Another blast, another Sherman hit, turret flying off. "Left side, movement!" Crawford shouted, eyes glued to the scope. Thompson gripped the shell in his hand. In that moment, in the corner of the small mirror's reflection, he saw a dark shape, a square, low silhouette rolling through the fog behind their left flank. "Panther, left rear!" he yelled. Hayes instantly rotated the turret. Crawford adjusted the sight. "About 800 meters!" Frank shouted. "Fire!" The explosion rumbled through the earth. The 75mm shell flew, striking the Panther's tread. The German tank halted, smoke pouring from its body. "Second shot," Hayes ordered. Thompson reloaded. Crawford fired. The second shell pierced the turret. Flames burst from within. The Panther caught fire, black smoke curling into the sky. The Sherman crew sat in silence for a few seconds. No one spoke. Only the distant crackle of metal burning could be heard. Then Hayes chuckled quietly through the radio. "Nice shot, Crawford. But how the hell did you see it that fast?" Crawford turned his head and pointed at the little steel mirror beside his seat. Hayes fell silent, stared at it, then gave a slight nod. "Keep it. We might need it a lot more." The battle raged on. That entire morning, Company C clashed continuously with German forces. Other Shermans began copying Thompson, attaching makeshift mirrors from metal scraps or personal items. The results were immediate. They spotted enemies sooner. They reacted faster. By noon, 12 Panthers had been destroyed. The radio buzzed with a report. Enemy retreating. Northern Aracourt secure. As the sun rose high, Thompson removed his helmet, wiped the sweat, and looked through the mirror. Blood, dust, and smoke streaked across the glass. He touched it gently, as if thanking a silent companion. In those short 3 seconds, on the edge of life and death, his idea had proven its worth. And from that small mirror, a wave of change began spreading through the American armored units in Lorraine. All from one modest tank on one September morning, where a mechanic soldier named Frank Thompson dared to do what no one else did. After September 19th, the Lorraine region was still thick with smoke and the thunder of artillery. The Germans hadn't withdrawn. They continued throwing tanks onto the Aracourt plain like desperate steel beasts. But this time, the Americans were different. The Shermans that had once been hunted now began taking the initiative. News spread faster than artillery shells. The story of one tank from Company C spotting and destroying a Panther from a blind spot spread through the battalion like a strange tale. Everyone asked, how did they do it? And then came the answer: a shaving mirror, wired in place, mounted to the left of the gunner's seat. At first, no one believed it. Some laughed, thinking it was just luck. But when 2, then 3, then 5 more Shermans followed suit, the results became undeniable. They survived more. They saw before they were seen. Crews who had once felt hopeless in the Lorraine fog suddenly had a tool to regain the initiative. Frank Thompson said almost nothing. He simply helped those who asked how to angle the mirror properly. For 3 nights straight, he and his crew quietly worked in the field maintenance area. No lights, no noise, just the flicker of flashlights and the soft clinking of metal. One drilled, one held the mirror, one tied the wire. And like that, each Sherman gained a new eye. They gave it many names: the rear eye, steel light, Thompson's mirror. Frank would chuckle every time he heard it. He didn't think he'd invented anything. He'd just done what was necessary to survive. But somewhere in the night, among the long line of silent tanks, he began to feel that this small thing was spreading, like a tiny flame passed from hand to hand. By the 3rd day, at sunrise, nearly half of the 37th Battalion had mirrors installed. The effect was too clear to ignore. Lieutenant Hayes, Frank's commander, decided to report it up the chain. The news reached Colonel Crichton Abrams on the morning of September 27th. When Abrams stepped onto the tank lot, he saw rows of Shermans with small mirrors glinting in the morning sun. He frowned, climbed onto one of the tanks, and inspected. The mirror was wired in place at a 45-degree angle, clearly reflecting the flanks and rear. He asked, "Who ordered this?" No one answered. The air grew tense. Then Frank stepped forward, a small figure among the towering steel machines. Standing at attention, he said loudly, "I did, sir. 14 tanks. No authorization." Abrams stared at him for a long moment, his gaze cold, then slowly stepped down. Everyone held their breath. He said nothing for a few seconds, just looked at the small mirror catching the morning light. Then he spoke, voice low. "You have 48 hours. Mount one on every tank in the battalion. That's an order." From that moment, Frank Thompson's mirror was no longer a personal initiative. It became an official directive. The tank yard buzzed like a giant machine shop. The sound of drills, hammers, and tightening wire rang through the night. Oil lamps flickered atop turrets, reflecting off hundreds of small mirrors. No one said much. They just worked in silence, united in one belief: that what they were doing could save someone's life tomorrow. 2 days later, on the morning of September 29th, 1944, every tank in the 37th Battalion of the 4th Armored Division had a reflective mirror installed. As the sun rose, hundreds of tiny lights flickered across the Lorraine fields, glints of metal in the fog, like hundreds of eyes opening, watching the battlefield. The Germans had no idea that in just 2 short nights, the Americans had gained a new advantage, one that couldn't be measured in numbers or firepower, but in the ability to see 3 seconds earlier. 3 seconds of life, 3 seconds of victory, 3 seconds that changed the course of the Battle of Aricourt. Morning of September 25th, 1944, Lorraine blazed with fire and smoke. Sherman tanks rumbled across damp fields, their treads grinding the cold earth. In the distance, German artillery thundered like rolling storms. The Germans threw in their last armored reserves, over 80 Panthers, Panzerfuß, and Stuggy 3 self-propelled guns, aiming to push the Americans out of Aricourt. But the Germans didn't know that the enemy they were about to face was no longer the fog-blinded tank crews from before. Patton's 4th Armored Division had changed. Every Sherman now had eyes on its back, small reflective mirrors installed by the hands of mechanics soldiers, men who didn't wait for permission to innovate. As the sun rose, its rays hit hundreds of mirrors, scattering flashes of light like glimmers of steel smiling across the battlefield. Amid the wind, the gunfire, and the roar of treads, something was different. For the first time, Shermans were reacting faster than Panthers. From every direction, American crews began spotting enemy shadows in their mirrors, rotating turrets a few seconds earlier. And those few seconds made a devastating difference. Over the next 4 fierce days, the battle raged on. The Germans lost 86 tanks, the Americans just 25 Shermans. A 3.1 ratio, an unprecedented victory in the history of armored warfare in Europe. At the field HQ, Colonel Creighton Abrams read the reports and smiled faintly. He knew something small had made something huge. German reconnaissance logs noted: American tanks are reacting unusually fast. Multiple cases of detecting rear ambushes. It's as if they have eyes on their backs. They were right. Those eyes, made only of steel, wire, and one idea, had changed the way Americans fought. When General Patton read the report at 3rd Army HQ, he issued a short order, one that would go down in history. Equip all Sherman tanks at the front with reflective mirrors. From Lorraine, the innovation spread across the 3rd Army, then to the 6th and 10th Armored Divisions. Within a month, what started as an unauthorized idea became a formal technical standard. In later battles at Nancy, Metz, and Bastogne, Shermans continued to carry that little mirror to the left of the gunner's seat, a quiet symbol of survival and ingenuity. Every time a Sherman rotated its turret in time, every time a crew made it home safe, someone in the tank would half joke, half sincerely say, "Thanks to Thompson's mirror." Frank never appeared in victory reports. No medal bore his name. But those who fought at Aricourt knew that victory wasn't won by firepower alone, nor by Patton's strategy alone, but by the hands of a young soldier who dared to drill a small hole into steel. An act forbidden, yet one that saved hundreds of lives. When the war ended, U.S. Army records noted, "Field modification, mirror device, origin unknown." No one knew that the origin was Frank Thompson, but the soldiers who survived knew exactly who had helped them come home. In their memory, the Battle of Aricourt wasn't just tanks versus tanks. It was a clash of 2 philosophies: the rigidity of German mechanics versus the flexibility of American minds. And in that clash, a tiny mirror reflected the spirit of an entire nation, the spirit of those who believed that even amidst fire and steel, creativity remains the greatest weapon. When the final shots of the Battle of Aricourt fell silent, October 1944 drifted by in the cold winds of Lorraine. The fields were scorched, tank carcasses lay tilted in the mist. The war continued pushing east, but for the 4th Armored Division, Aricourt had become a symbol, not just of victory, but of transformation. Frank Thompson kept doing his job as a loader. He didn't think much about the mirror anymore. By now, it was just another normal part of the Sherman, like the steering wheel, the barrel, or the sight. Every morning before moving out, he'd wipe the dust off the mirror, look into it for a few seconds, then begin the day. He knew it had helped him survive, but he never thought of it as an invention. To him, it was instinct, the instinct of a mechanic who refused to watch his friends die without doing something. From Lorraine to the Ardennes, through Bastogne, the mirror followed him every step. It reflected the fire of cannon blasts, the tense face of Crawford, and Frank's calloused hands every time he loaded a shell. They survived the winter of 1944, and then, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Frank sat inside the old Sherman, the cabin heavy with the smell of smoke and engine oil, staring silently toward the horizon where the guns had gone quiet. He said nothing. Crawford placed a hand on his shoulder and simply said, "We made it home." After the war, Frank was discharged and returned to Pennsylvania. He worked in a steel shop, where the sound of hammers and the smell of oil reminded him of the tank. Only now, there were no shells. He got married, had 2 daughters, and lived as simply as any other worker. No one at the shop knew the gray-haired man once saved hundreds of lives with a small mirror. In Army records, the idea was recorded plainly. Field modification, mirror device, origin unknown. No name, no credit. Frank didn't care. When asked about the war, he'd just say, "I was a loader, that's all." He never talked about Lorraine, never about drilling through steel in the fog. He only remembered the faces: Martinez, Kozlowski, Crawford, Hayes, the ones who went through fire with him. In 1992, nearly half a century later, a historian named Robert Ellis, while researching Sherman tactics, found a small note in the maintenance logs of the 37th Battalion. "Mirror installed, Esteker Thompson." That single line sparked a journey. He tracked down Crawford, now an old man living in Detroit. Crawford told him the whole story, about Martinez, the night Frank secretly installed the mirror, the day Abrams ordered the idea to be scaled. It took Ellis 6 months to follow the trail. He finally found Frank, then 74, working in a small garage on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. When Ellis asked, "Were you really the first to install that mirror?" Frank just smiled, wiped oil from his hands with a rag, and said quietly, "I did it because I didn't want to see my friends die anymore, that's all." Ellis's article appeared in Military History Review in 1994. It was short, but enough for a few veterans to read it. In the following months, Frank received 3 letters. One from a tank commander who survived Lorraine thanks to the mirror, one from a soldier in the 6th Armored Division, saying they learned the mirror trick from Thompson's crew, and one from a woman in Ohio, the daughter of a tanker who made it home, thanking him for helping her father return. Frank read each letter, folded them carefully, and kept them in an old wooden box. He never showed them to anyone. He lived quietly like that until March 14, 2003, when his heart gave out at age 84. His funeral was small, just family and a few friends. But 3 men came, strangers to the family. They wore wool coats and bore the old 4th Armored Division patch. They placed a small, cloth-wrapped object on Frank's grave. When his daughter unwrapped it, inside was a 3-4-inch mirror, its metal frame scratched, bound in twisted wire, gleaming in the sun. They only said one sentence: "Because of him, we lived." Then they left, as quietly as Frank had lived. Today, if you visit the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, you'll find a Sherman on display. To the left of the gunner's seat, there's a small steel mirror, old frame, wired in place. There's no plaque, no label. But those who know the story understand. This is the legacy of Frank Thompson, the mechanic who dared to change history with just his hands and an idea. That mirror still reflects light, just as it reflects the spirit of a generation that didn't wait for orders to create, didn't need medals to do what was right. In war, not every hero waves a flag or wears a ribbon. Some just hold a mirror,